Hey there and welcome to class. So today we are going to talk about steering systems. I think it's safe to say we all know the purpose of a steering system, right? To turn the wheels for directional control. Now, how we do that is a whole nother question. Let's start with at its basis, if we're talking the most basic steering system or vehicle that we could talk about, that would be a manual steering system, meaning you don't have power steering. We'll talk about those components later. If we're talking just a base steering system, we've got three major subsystems that are going to have components in them. The first one's going to be the steering column. So your steering column, meaning what's going to attach your steering wheel to the next component, which is our steering gear. Now your steering gear can be a different design from vehicle to vehicle. Most manufacturers these days are going to use a rack and pinion for their steering gear. We need some sort of gear that's going to transfer this motion, your rotary motion, into a sweeping or angular motion, and that's going to be your steering gear. Like I said, usually rack and pinion is what's used today, but a lot of vehicles, a lot of trucks, Chevy really only kind of sort of recently went to a rack and pinion. For the longest time they used a steering gear box, not to be confused with a steering gear. Steering gear is whatever you're using to change the rotary motion to an angular or sweeping motion. Now that can, like I said, can be a rack and pinion or a gear box. And we'll get into those in a moment here. And then lastly, some sort of linkage that's going to go from our steering gear to our steering knuckles so we can actually make the change from our steering wheel to the wheels and have our wheels sweep from right to left, whichever direction you so choose. So let's start at the steering column. Your steering column, like I said, is connected to your steering wheel. So when you go to turn your steering wheel, you are going to turn a shaft. Now there's a number of components in here. We won't break it down too crazy. Like I said, this is an automotive principles class, so we're just going to sort of keep it basic, but in a suspension class you will get a lot deeper into steering columns. It's important to know that any and all modern steering columns, so the column or the shaft that's going to go from your steering wheel down to the steering gear is going to be collapsible. In the event of an accident, you don't want to be impaled by your steering column, which has happened plenty of times with older vehicles. It's how, I actually think that might be how James Dean died, but I can't remember, so don't quote me on it. But lots of people died because they were impaled by their steering column. So to keep that from happening when you get into a really gnarly accident, they make the steering column collapsible. So in the event of a really hard impact, the column is actually going to collapse onto itself. You can't ever reset it. They are permanently collapsed if that ever happens. But hey, you're alive. So there's a give and take there. Now, with your steering column, if it is really most new steering columns, even baseline ones, are still have tilt wheel. Older steering columns may not have tilt wheel, meaning you have adjustment to change the angle of your steering wheel. If you want to drive like a bus driver, or if you want the steering wheel as far down as possible. I'm a short person, so all the vehicles I drive, the steering wheel is pretty much as far down as possible. But really fancy columns may have a telescoping feature, meaning you can actually change the steering wheel depth to get it closer to you or further away. So if you're a really large person or taller person versus a really short person, you need to get closer to the pedals. Maybe you don't want to be right up on the steering wheel, so you might be able to telescope it so it's further away. Just so you know, it's really not safe for you to be driving all up on the steering wheel. If you get into an accident, there's a pretty nice airbag that's going to come at you, and if you're that close to it, it's not going to feel good. So you may have tilt or telescoping features. Now to the steering gear box. This is an older design. Less and less vehicles use a steering gear box these days. From your steering column. So when I make the rotary change or angle in my steering wheel, so I turn my steering wheel, what is happening is my column turns in that same motion. Now what we need to do is change this motion into a sweeping or angular motion, and that's what our steering gearbox is going to do. So the steering gearbox has one of two things. or one of two designs. It's going to either be what we call a recirculating ball design. So what you're going to do is you're moving this steering shaft, which has a sort of spiral design on it, and it's going to have these little ball bearings. And as you turn it, there is what you can almost call a nut. They're calling it a ball nut rack on here. So there's a ball bearing in there. And when you turn the steering wheel, this is going to actually move, kind of like a nut on a bolt, up or down on that steering gear. Now what that's going to do is it's going to mesh. That nut has a couple of teeth that are going to mesh onto what you call your sector gear, and that sector gear is going to change in angle, and this is probably not the best angle to look at it, but it's going to change this motion to this motion, and that's how your recirculating ball works. And now the next design is going to be a worm and roller, and a worm and roller has a spiral gear that is called a worm gear, and as we turn it, it's going to turn or change your roller gear. And that, again, is going to take this motion into this motion. This gearbox can be manual or power steering. We'll talk a little bit more about power steering in a moment. This is just the manual design without any help. Now, with a steering gearbox, you're going to need some linkages to attach essentially from either the roller gear or the sector gear that's trying to go this way, right? So from my steering gear box, I'm going to have some sort of set of linkage. Now, a gearbox design requires a lot more linkages, all kinds of connections to go out to our wheel hubs or our steering knuckles. And this is just one, a common design. There is more than just this one, but a common one that uses a steering gearbox is going to be a parallelogram type linkage. So what we're missing here is our gearbox. Our steering gearbox would sit right here. And what it's going to do is it's going to turn like I said, either the sector gear or a roller gear. And it's going to take this, what we call a pitman arm, and it's going to pretty much turn that arm to do this. Well, I need to move that out to my wheels. So what we did is we attached to that pitman arm that's doing this motion and attached what we call a center link, also known as a drag link. Because we do want to transfer this motion, now the drag link or center link is going to be moving back and forth. And so it's not flopping around here on the other end. We have another arm that's attached to the frame called an idler arm. So now I've got a pitman arm and an idler arm, and in the center here I've got this drag link. So now I've got this type of motion. I still need to attach it to my steering knuckle. So in yellow here, we've got our tie rods. We've got inner tie rods and we have outer tie rods. And as this center link goes back and forth, my tie rod on each end is going to attach to the center link and to our steering knuckle, which in turn is going to have this sort of motion. And this sort of motion is going to push or pull the steering knuckle to make our wheels do something like this. And that's how a parallelogram steering system works. Now here's why we got rid of it, and a lot of manufacturers don't use it anymore, is because I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wearable joints. And those wearable joints over time are going to create problems when they wear out, and looseness in the steering, and it's going to be more potential for problems. And so this design, it works just fine, but the problem is there's too many points of wear. And so eventually you are going to have a steering system that you can move the steering wheel and nothing happens at the wheels because there's so much looseness in some of these joints here. And you can usually pinpoint the looseness or the loose joint by doing a dry park test. So it requires 2 people. One person's going to be inside the vehicle, sort of moving the steering wheel back and forth. You're not trying to move the actual wheels. You're just trying to turn the steering wheel in one direction until the wheels are about to move, and then back in the other direction until the wheels are about to move but don't really move. So you end up turning the steering wheel back and forth like this, and while the wheels aren't doing anything, the second person is going to hop underneath the car. This has to be on the ground, by the way. It can't be in the air because we need weight on the vehicle's wheels. And the person underneath the car is going to look at each one of these joints. And so if I can see that my pitman arm is moving but my center link isn't, then I know that this is the worn joint. If I can see that my center link is moving but my tie rod arms are not, I know that the inner tie rods there are going to be the wearable or the worn out component. So there's ways to check where that looseness is when it does happen. Here's another example, and in fact this is actually a better picture in your canvas because this is if we're sitting on top of the vehicle from the driver's side. Here's our steering gearbox, right? So this is your recirculating ball, and as you turn your shaft there, this is our sector shaft that's going to move, and it's going to turn our pitman arm in one direction or another. And here's our idler arm, here's our track rod. There's so many terms. The center link can also be called a center link, a drag link, or a track rod, by the way. Many names. And then we've got our tie rods on each end as well. These tie rods, the lengths are adjustable to help with your wheel alignment when it does get out of alignment. We'll talk about that in